Egyptian Tales presents How Dreadful an Anxiety Is by Yusuf Idris, read by Juliana Ibrahim. I could say that I once suffered from depression. This is because the tragic comic nature of depression is that the one who begins to suffer from it doesn't realize it, but rather sinks into it without being aware. Depression is not sadness as it's commonly known and understood. It's not simply a feeling of sorrow, loneliness, and so on, although these can be some of its symptoms. Scientifically, depression is a type of an anxiety disorder, and it occurs as an unconscious reaction to mental and psychological issues, both rational and irrational. When I was suffering from depression, I could not find any meaning or resonance in the doctor's words when they said this to me. I was immersed in despair. When someone is inside it, they cannot identify the cause of their state. In fact, they do not even realize that they are not behaving normally. All that happens is that after recovery, the person feels that they were always on edge, involuntarily swallowing food and drink and barely enduring daily life. They wake up without any desire to get out of bed, with no motivation for anything. Just their daily goal and the purpose of their life are completely unclear. There, they stumble, sometimes overwhelmed by an exaggerated, sad from of cheerfulness, and other times they cry as though they have just lost their parents, surrounded by complete darkness. At other times, a huge rebellious fit overtakes them, and they act out like someone imprisoned who tries to escape. They rebel, commit foolish acts, and suddenly feel themselves with an intense hatred towards someone or something, as if that person or situation is a cause of all their troubles. It's a state of rebellion and attempts to release the latent, aggressive energy that exists in every human being, which in healthy and sane individuals transforms into creative energy or rational resilience against obstacles or oppressive people, or an excess of ambition to reach higher ranks. Their energy manifests as destructive childish behavior, recklessly causing harm, creating chaos, and damaging both people and things around him. Well, there are countless symptoms, and they take on an individual form for each one due to their circumstances, makeup, and personality. However, there are always common signs among those suffering from depression, especially that deep, tormenting inner sensation, which psychologists have described by saying the depressed person develops an unconscious desire to shrink into themselves and transform into a fetus, returning to where they came from, their mother's womb, or more precisely, they wish to return to the nothingness from which they emerged, death. I've seen every doctor here and abroad and tried every medication out there, but nothing has cured me. Its force overwhelming, leaving me powerless beneath its weight. And the greatest part of it, it was due to the anxiety gripped me. Suddenly, as if it had found a swift hold on my fate. It consumed my thoughts, wrapping around my life like a tiny coal, and in that moment I saw no escape, only the suffocating presence of fear. I didn't know that my very deep mind was approaching things from different perspective, wanting death and asking for it, to the point that I often dreamed of it, coming gently and beautifully like a delicate dream, I felt my soul withdrawn from my body as if it were a violin blow playing its retreat in the tail of a very soft musical tune. Very beloved, wishing for you to wait for the end, its end, your end, and the end of the whole situation and the siege with an eagerness that is not hurried but also hastening. Thus, it was inevitable that this deep seated desire would eventually lead me to confront true death one day, not just once, but several times. I might write about it, and it may become a story, or I may never do so. There is a vast difference between seeing it as a dream prepared by a foolish deep mind and facing it as a terrifying reality. The worst part of this reality is that it's silent. There is no noise, no commotion, like conspiracies. Life fades away. You feel it dying. Your mind preserves. You're petrified and you've nothing. You're so terrified that you even forget who are you, what the end is, and the end, death, and deep desires become things you loathe, to the point where you fear dying from the overwhelmed hatred seething within you. It was as though that moment was a trap known only to him, pulling him so close to me that it frightened me to the point where I turned back, loving life with all my might. The heat of that encounter was enough to melt away any sorrow and any depression capable of healing, any anxiety, pulling it out by its roots. And so I was born again, without anxiety or depression. But it's a dreadful cure, one that I do not wish for all the world, for what illness in the world is better than it? Of course, it's better than death. You've every right to shrug your shoulders, for you for you have not seen it. Beware, for the worst part of it. It's betrayal. Betrayal that comes and goes without allowing us the time to build its features. But what is all this talk about misery, death, and anxiety and depression? The real cause is that I started to panic about the phenomenon of collective depression affecting large sectors of our middle and working classes. Also, the question I once raised about the possibility of this type of collective illness remains unanswered, waiting for responses from doctors, psychologists, and sociologists. But what I know for sure is that 9 out of 10 of the scholars I met in our beloved Cairo, whether walking on foot, riding bicycles, trucks, or carts, the sellers and buyers, most of them suffer from an internal anxiety, whether some are aware of it or not. The vast majority do not realize it. They suffer from symptoms without understanding their cause, suffering whether they want to or not, and even suffering despite their desperate attempts not to suffer. And anxiety is part of our life journey. We used to live under circumstances that had begun to stabilize to some extent since the early 60s until the defeat of 1967. On a personal level, most groups were reassured that they were not threatened, at least not in the near future, by disasters such as dismissal or loss of economic income. True, incomes were low, but there was a constant reliance on the state. Private activity was largely limited, and we were all workers, farmers, intellectuals, and employees in one way or another, receiving our pay at the end of the month, season, or year. While the state went through all stages of the development of the public ownership experiment, from bureaucracy to government to dependency and all other melodies. Suddenly, we were defeated in a decisive and premeditated defeat in 1967. Overnight, it became clear to us that what we had been relying on was not a great state that would protect us, but rather it was as if we had been relying on a leaning wall that had completely fallen within hours, and its entire life had become threatened with collapse. Here, a large part of our tragedy in the defeat and its aftermath, which affected us all as if we were in a state of frustration and depression, was not only because of the great blow we suffered as a nation, but rather the deeper cause was that our minds, both conscious and subconscious, began to worry. That is, to look at the future with uneasy and trusting eyes, so that no one among us was sure not only of his position in the future, but even of his position at the time. Era after era, we as a society began to sink into a state of collective depression as bitterness piled up within us like accumulating illness. Gamal Abdel Nasser tried to pull himself out of his situation to begin a phase of resistance, which eventually led to what was then called the War of Attrition. Despite the great individual heroism exerted during the war, its result was entirely opposite. The deliberate destruction of the Suez Canal, the displacement of hundreds of thousands, the destruction of factories, schools, bridges, and infrastructure was as though it was done by the state to confirm that our extreme anxiety was justified. And indeed, over time, this anxiety only increased. In fact, anxiety deepens with the passage of days, particularly following the events concerning the resistance, a beacon of hope in Jordan. Nasser, the immortal leader, died from the severity of his depression. Our sorrow for him was unprecedented. It wasn't just the sorrow of a nation losing its leader, but the sorrow of depressed individuals bidding farewell to their last hope of escaping and living, of overcoming defeat, of eliminating anxiety, and of returning okay. And so, when the promised day arrived, we unloaded our accumulated bitterness, poisoning the enemy, its fortifications, and its forces. One way to escape anxiety and depression is to identify your enemy and the cause of your anxiety and crush it. We did that day. We healed together and we returned to life as children again, laughing, collaborating, and working together. Chivalry, heroism, and sacrifice returned and we returned okay. But it was inevitable that this wouldn't last. It was inevitable that the two greatest powers would once again restrain us, limit our movement towards the enemy. But we did not despair. Instead, we resolved to confront the root of the 1967 setback, to examine the very fabric of the state and the bond between the revolution and its people. We came to see that the true cause of the defeat lay in a relationship that had become more oppressive than revolutionary, more repressive than one of liberation, and freedom. Then the economic crisis, especially after the war, worsened. The anxiety about the future returned once again, but this time it did not take the form of the collective healthy anxiety that was the cause of the October victory. Rather, it took the form of individual despair. In truth, the middle and working classes suffered the most from the burden of any economic crisis. This is because the fierce class struggle turns into a terrifying process of defense in itself. The working class constantly dreams of reaching the guaranteed middle income level or perhaps even wealth. The middle class is driven by two forces: the web of ambition, urging them to become wealthier and secure their future completely, and the terrifying web of fear, pulling them back into the ranks of the working class. The employee becomes a worker, the worker becomes unemployed, and the grocer turns into a shop boy. At this point, an anxiety sets in and it becomes terrifying. It's no longer just about the future, much of it's anxiety about the present. How could it not be when I rarely meet a taxi driver who is actually a taxi driver? Instead, I meet teachers, teaching assistants at universities, or sometimes even police officers. How could it not be when, to maintain their middle class status, they work as laborers and the crisis deepens? People began to divide, as if it were the day of judgment. Survival at any cost, by any means, including furnished apartment or worse. Anything to preserve one's economic standing, no matter the cost to dignity. What happens when I fall from the second floor where I live to the basement of life? And may those who steal, embezzle, scam, plunder, sell, or broker escape unscathed as long as they preserve their economic status, for they would have lost all value, even in their own eyes, during the salvation process. I smile as I read many candidates' names and slogans in the elections. It's as if they aren't running to represent citizens or trends, but rather running an economic election, aiming to gather voter support, only to trade it later for an improved economic position or for a political position that will lead to economic advancement. Yes, there is an economic crisis. But this individual confrontation, this horrific race to climb over others' shoulders, to kick, insult, argue, and trample on them, this insane fear that pull the rug out from under you, might lift and send you back to the abyss of the working class again, is reflected in everything we see on the streets: signs of rebellion, chaos, and filth. Everything we speak, the rampant plays that destroy all values, numb the painful wounds of pride and dignity. In such a race, you must numb yourself completely, refusing to let anyone remind you of a principle or value of empathy, tenderness, self denial, sacrifice, or shame. You must forget entirely that you are human. You want to be nothing more than a constant painting with no ideals or principles to stop you from rising. I believe this individual solution will never work. Any developing country like ours, with our circumstances and system of education, every year hundreds of thousands of people with mediocre qualifications are produced. The system takes from the working class and places them in a congested, resentful middle class, unlimited resources. The ability to borrow will always be restricted, and the dreams of most people will remain unattainable. Only one in thousand may prosper, while the rest either stay as they are or descend into decline. Amidst all this and more, individual concern or personal solutions can only lead to a life of destruction. Yes, there is a crisis. Not just an economic one, but more importantly, it's a crisis of economic anxiety that is sweeping through the majority of our society. Even children, the effect started to seep into. If you ask a 5-year-old boy or a girl what they want to be, they will say, I want to be an engineer or a doctor. Although children used to dream of seeing the wonders of the world, playing music, dancing, or singing, even their innocence is now tainted by economic anxiety. People around us in the Arab world are suffering from the fear of sudden wealth and resorting to instinctual behaviors. And we too are driven by our instinct, not the instincts of sex or pleasure, but the more basic ones, the instinct to defend our very existence, an existence threatened by overwhelming economic anxiety. Wouldn't you like us to search together for a solution? Surrendering to this kind of an anxiety will not solve our economic or psychological crisis. On the contrary, it will only worsen it and lead to even more suffering. If this is the race we are running, the result will be collective collapse. Our most valuable thing is the human being, and first and foremost, we must save him. Want to be an engineer or a doctor means in a world shaped by economic anxiety, their dreams have narrowed to the pursuit of professions that promise stability and security, careers that wear the guise of certainty like those in medicine and engineering.